Before desegregation, the African Studies Department kind of message about Africa would have been much different than, say, let's study the problems and think about the solutions, and, let's study the diversity of Africa, and let's study the history of African people as their own people. I could see how it would be about, here's how we influenced Africa, here's how we brought the light to these African people. I think diversity, if there wasn't the same African Studies Department, it would have had a very different message in classes, I think.
My name is Jake McBride. I'm from Columbus, Georgia, and I'm a sophomore math major with pre-law intent. At the very beginning of my freshman year, I became aware of invisible children at UGA, so I started going to Invisible Children and learning about the political situation going on in East Africa. I would say most people are white, but compared to my math classes, and even not, especially my math classes, but also a lot of my other non-African studies classes, there are a lot more black students in there. In my African Studies 4200, which was critical issues in development in sub-Saharan Africa, there was a good, maybe 25% of the class were black students from Africa. So it was really interesting to get to talk to them because a lot of the issues they had felt themselves. I think the Swahili department is a lot of white students. I think it's got the reputation for being an easy language. And my literature class, I think, has a lot of white students. I think some of the higher and more advanced African studies courses, I think black students might be overrepresented compared to their population at the university for those classes. If they're not black professors, they're usually white professors that have a deep interest in Africa, who've been to Africa, lived in Africa, friends in Africa, and like that. But I think for my classes, it's been about half and half. I'm not sure because I'm white and I'm interested in African studies. I think it's just because I'm interested in forgotten continent. At the risk of sounding a little racist, I don't mean that in a bad way. I just mean that it's kind of ignored compared to European history and American history. It's really diverse, but at the same time, there's a similar theme to the stories of African countries and people. And I think a lot of black students might find it interesting, especially if they're from Africa, to learn about the causes behind the current political crises and famines and cause of the spread of HIV and everything. So for me, it's just interesting as kind of like an outsider and like a friend of Africa, but I think maybe for black students, it's kind of a sense of, this is where my family was from. In most of my other classes, it's predominantly white. I think math is a kind of area where it's assumed, there's like an assumption that white male students, this is for you, as opposed to this is for everyone. I know that there are some black math majors here, but I don't see any of my classes. I have a few women in some of my classes, but certain math classes, especially the more challenging ones, you don't really see that as much. So I'm not exactly sure why that is. And after desegregation, if I was a black student and if I was a woman, it would be kind of challenging to break into that kind of space, that atmosphere of just white maleness. Most of my other classes are mostly white. My French class has some black students in there. I think that the black population at UJ is pretty small, and I think when you take African studies classes, you get a little bit more African and African American students, and when you take things like math and physics, you're probably less likely to see that.